From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Washington has a few lawyers in it. Can I ask hands of lawyers? Any lawyers out there? Why are you sitting so far back? Don't you know people? And we know maybe 90% of those lawyers are pretty sure they have a book in there somewhere, and maybe, 37% of them have spent 3 years writing that book, and all right, 14% have spent another 2 years trying to get it published. But that's where the statistics stop, because in the end there's only one David Baldacci. In 1996, he grabbed the brass ring right out of the gate with a book called Absolute Power, which is about the damage that politicians can do outside of politics, for a change. He's followed that with 13 more New York Times bestsellers, including what I consider the go-to book on killing people in the Library of Congress, The Collectors, Not to mention his most recent effort, eagerly awaited First Family, with more than 50 million copies in print, in more than 40 languages and more than 80 countries. This is a local boy who's made good, real good. Please welcome David Baldacci.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate you guys hanging out with all the bad weather. And I didn't think anybody was going to be here when I showed up at 4:30. I thought everybody would just would have checked out, but I really appreciate you hanging out to hear me. Book Festival, I think this is probably the greatest attendance they've ever had at the Book Festival. This is my 6th time at the Book Festival. I think it's more than any other author, and I think it's because there was a serious computer glitch with the Library of Congress. I think they keep wanting to invite a guy named David Baldwin, a David Baldacci, a David Baldacci, and they keep inviting me instead. But I love to be here, and it's great to see the crowds and the enthusiasm and the energy that all of you have for books and writers. It really means a lot to all of us to see such great crowds out here. Now, I'm a former trial lawyer. I spent 10 years of my life arguing with people and arguing cases in state and federal court. And over the course of my career as a published author, I've given many, many speeches across the country with presidents and former presidents and congressmen and senators and, big muckety-mucks in the audience. And I enjoy public speaking a lot. I never really get nervous anymore about it. But about 11 years ago, I accepted a speaking invitation, and as soon as I accepted it, I regretted it. Because even for me, with all my public speaking experience, it really was too much pressure. And as the day came for me to do this event, I became increasingly morose and irritable and nervous. And finally, the day came for me to go. And after much soul-searching and realizing that I had committed to do this event, I decided to do the right thing. I asked my wife to call them and tell them I was dangerously ill. Well, my wife didn't call anybody. Instead, she grabbed me by the arm and pulled me uncomfortably close and said, "You're going to go to your daughter's kindergarten class, and you're talking to those 5-year-olds. Well, I'm a very strong, independent man, so I did exactly as my wife said. It was Parents' Career Week at my kids' school, and moms and dads would come in and tell the kids what they did for a living. Now, my dilemma had been made even more difficult because my daughter had come home the day before as excited as I'd ever seen her. And she said, "Dad, today was the best day ever in my kindergarten career." And I said, "Really, why was that?" And she said, "Well, Tommy's mom came in today, and she's something called a marine biologist. I don't know what that is. But, Dad, she brought live fish." It was so cool. And then my daughter looked at me and said, "What are you going to do?" Because until she was around 7 years old, if you asked my daughter what her dad did for a living, she wouldn't say that her dad wrote books. She said, "My dad signs his name in books and people pay him because they like his handwriting." And my daughter also added, she said, "Dad, when you come to school tomorrow, you can't write in the books or the teacher will give you a timeout. So just watch it." So with all this pressure, but the order from my wife that I had to go, so I went. I took the movie poster for Absolute Power because I wanted to talk to the kids about how books can be turned into pictures. And as an ace in the hole, I took a stack of my foreign language editions, just in case things went really bad in kindergarten. So I went to the class, and there were 25 5-year-olds gathered around the floor, and we were sitting there, and we talked about books and reading and how much fun it was to use your imagination. And we had a terrific, terrific time for about 2.5 minutes, which apparently is the attention span of a 5-year-old, and which I've since learned as a father is 2 minutes and 10 seconds longer than the attention span of a teenager. So then I pulled out my movie poster. We talked about how books can be turned into movies, and we talked about some of their favorite movies that had been adapted from books. And again, we had a great conversation for 2.5 minutes. And then Timmy was looking at Bobby's belly button, and two little boys were writing on the chalkboard, and a little girl was wandering around, talking to the ceiling, apparently seeing things there I could not. And that's when I pulled out my ace in the hole, my foreign language editions. So I said, okay, boys and girls, we're going to play a game. It's called Guess the Language. I'm going to hold up this stack of books one by one, and you have to guess the language on the cover before we move on to the next book. I figured this would make me golden for the next 25 minutes I was scheduled to be with them. So I held up the first book, and a little boy immediately said, that's Spanish. I said, okay, that was an easy one. I held up another book. A little girl said, that's Korean. I put that book down. I picked up another book. A little boy in the back said, that's Mandarin Chinese. I put that one down. I picked up another book. A little girl stood up and said, that's Hebrew. I looked at the cover and thought, that's what that one is. I had no idea. I just thought it was a big printing snafu. So I went through all my books in about 12 seconds. The kids knew all of them immediately until I only had one book left. And I said, okay, I bet nobody can guess this language. And I held it up. And I remember, even though it's 11 years ago, I remember so clearly this little girl standing up. She had like 2 ponytails. She has her little hands on her little hips, and she's looking at me like I'm the biggest dunce she has ever seen. And she said, that's Latvian. Does anybody here speak Latvian? Later, their teacher said, you know, Mr. Baldacci, this school is in a suburb of Washington, D.C., and 24 foreign languages are spoken here. And I looked at the woman and said, thanks for telling me. So I had 20-odd minutes left with these kids. I had no magic bullets left. And I thought to myself, as they're all like staring at me, you know, you were a trial lawyer, you're paid to think quickly on your feet, come up with something, they're just kids. And finally I hit upon the perfect solution. I turned to the kids and I smiled and I said, does anybody have any questions? Don't ever do that with 5-year-olds. Unless you don't care about having any self-respect left at all. So a pretty little girl in the front row jumps up, she's waving her hand, and I said, do you have a question? Well, she didn't have a question. She proceeded to tell a highly personal and highly embarrassing story about her mother. No, I mean highly personal and highly embarrassing in the delightful way that only a 5-year-old can manage to do. So I'm sort of just struck dumb while all of her classmates start giggling. And I look over at the teacher for support, and of course she's staring at the ceiling, shaking her head in disbelief that I had been stupid enough to open the floor for questions with 5-year-olds. I finally found my voice. I looked back at the little girl. I told my daughter to sit down. And to never speak again while I was still alive. Which I would not be much longer if her mother ever found out about this. But I survived kindergarten, so I feel like I could survive anything. I started out as a short story writer. When I was a kid, my mom bought a blank page book because I used to just tell these long-winded yarns, usually to get myself out of trouble with parents and assorted school officials and people like that. And I fell in love with the written word and telling stories on a page. And I never have stopped. For a long time, I couldn't make a living doing it, but it was such a part of my life that I spent year after year trying to get better at it. I wrote short stories for many years, starting in high school and trying to get those published, in these really obscure rags you'd never even heard of. The New Yorker, Atlantic Monthly, just the pits. And I got lots of rejections back. Oftentimes cruel rejections like, we're really sorry, but we only represent talent, stuff like that. But I kept going. And even though I didn't sell any short stories back then, I branched out into screenplay writing because a friend of mine went out to Los Angeles to break into film as a producer, wasn't successful, but when he came back to Virginia, he brought with him what was then an unproduced script. This was many years ago, that he had gotten somehow out there, and he asked me to read it and see what I thought of it, and I read it, and I hated it. I thought it was just drivel. There's no character development. The humor was all sort of stupid humor, and there was no plot. It was just like a series of stupid vignettes strung together. And I was convinced no one would make a movie out of this mess. Austin Powers went on to become an enormous hit. Huge. I'm sure nobody here went to see it, but apparently millions of your fellow citizens did, and they really liked it a lot. So even though clearly I had no taste when it came to screenplays, because I'd missed all the subtle nuances and sophistication of the Austin Powers franchise, nevertheless, I started writing screenplays and did that for about 4 years. Got a screenplay agent in Los Angeles based on my scripts, and I thought, I'll be a lawyer during the day, and maybe I'll be a screenplay writer at night, and maybe have some of my scripts optioned, and that was really my modest ambition at that point in my life. Then I got an idea for writing a novel, and that novel turned out to be Absolute Power. I spent 3 years of my life writing it while I was practicing law full time, and you can say a lot of negative things about lawyers, and trust me, I've heard them all, but one thing you can't say about lawyers is that they don't work hard. They work hard, pull a lot of hours, and that's just the way the career and the profession is. So I would come home at night and go down to my little cubby hole and write at night. So after 3 years, I had Absolute Power. Now, for those of you who haven't read the book or seen the movie upon which it was hardly based at all, the premise, I think the best stories have simple premises, and then you complicate them in other ways. The premise of Absolute Power is pretty simple. President, United States, not a nice person. He has affairs with other women. During one of these trysts, something really bad happens. There has to be a cover-up. Eventually, the truth comes out. At the end of the novel, he's impeached. Now, when I wrote that story, it was entirely original. I have probably gotten 10,000 emails from people over the years, taking me to task for taking a national tragedy and exploiting it in fiction, even when I point out the fact that the book was written years before the president you might be thinking about right now, but they didn't really care to hear that. It was just that I wanted to explore that side of the presidency. And that cheer wasn't for me, by the way. That was something else. And it was an interesting. I wanted to tell a story about what happens to people who have tied their careers to the presidency, and the president does something really bad. All their careers, all their hard work goes down the drain. And I wanted to explore sort of that moral dilemma that people had. So it was a big success, #1 bestseller, made into a movie, sold all over the world. And all of a sudden, a guy who had started modestly as a short story writer was this #1 best-selling thriller writer. It changed my life absolutely and forever, and I'm very happy that it did. Now, it's interesting when you've written as many novels as I've written, and you travel as much as I do, and I travel everywhere. It's rare that I don't see somebody out in public reading one of my books. I can't remember the last time I was on a plane when I didn't pass somebody going to the restroom and saw one of my books, or on a train, or at a hotel, or by a pool. In fact, I was coming back from New York the other day, and on the train there was a guy reading one of my novels. And it's funny, I've seen a lot of people reading them here. I don't know what that's about, but And I have one rule about that. If I ever see you reading one of my books in public, I will never come up to you for two reasons. One, I'm actually a very private person. I would never want to invade someone else's privacy in that way. And secondly, and far more importantly, if you're not enjoying the book, I don't want to hear about it. You know, that goes under the category of life is just too short. But a few years ago, I was in the middle of a book tour, and I flew into LAX really late at night. Got off the plane. I just wanted to go grab my bag and go to my hotel. I had a busy day the next day. And I'm heading down the concourse, and all of a sudden I see this guy standing in the middle of the aisle. There's luggage strewn all around him, and he's standing there reading a book. Now, my first reaction to this was this guy has no life at all. You know, it's almost midnight at LAX, and he's standing all by himself reading a book. My second reaction was one of curiosity. What in the world could this guy be reading? As I walked by and looked back, I saw he was reading a copy of Absolute Power. You know, then I was sort of confused. What should I do? He looked okay. He was reading the novel, but I have this rule. And finally I thought, what the heck? So I walked over to him and I said, it really looks like you're enjoying that book. And he didn't even lower the book. I couldn't even see his face. But he said, yeah, it's a page turner. I really love this book. I said, well, actually, I'm really glad to hear that. Would you like me to sign it for you? And then the book came down a little bit, so I could see this guy staring at me like I wasn't crazy. And he said, no. He said, why would I want you to put your name in my book? And I was stunned. I took a step back and I said, sir, I mumbly stumbly. I said, I'm so sorry. I actually have a rule about not doing what I just did, but I saw you reading the book and you said you were enjoying it. And I just thought you'd like it autographed because I wrote it. And he looked at me, he was like, no, you didn't. I took another step back and I said, well, ironically enough, Absolute Power is my very first novel. And I can assure you, I am David Baldacci. Then the guy points a finger at me. I won't tell you which one. And he said, look, you freak. You're not Baldacci, and get away from me. You know, by now, a small crowd had gathered around us. I guess they're waiting for the fist to start flying. I'm a nice guy. I really am. I'm a calm guy, and it takes a lot to get me upset. But this man had pushed my buttons way past maximum. So I said, excuse me. So I reached up, I ripped the book out of his hand. I spun it around where there's a big picture of me on the back. I held it up to my face, and I said, do you see Buckaroo? I am David Baldacci. So he looks at the picture, he looks at me, he gets a really stupid expression on his face. He reaches into his pocket, he pulls out a pen. The guy's looking down at his shoes and he's chuckling and he said, Mr. Baldacci, what an honor. He said, will you sign my book, sir, please? What could I do? I laughed too, and I slapped him on his back as hard as I could. And I said, no. But I signed it. I signed his book. Now, last year I took my family to Italy. I'd been there before, but my kids had not. And I wanted to take them to a little village a little bit north of Pisa called Barga, where my grandfather was born and where he grew up before he immigrated to the United States. And I had never been there. It's a walled city, much like Lucca, except smaller. And so we were going to make plans to go there. And before we left to leave for Italy, I got an email from the mayor of Barga who said, I read in an Italian magazine that you were spending your holiday in Italy. Okay. And I would like to invite you to Barga, and I would like to take you to lunch in Barga. I said, that's wonderful. We're planning to come anyway, so I'll just bring my family and the friends we're traveling with, and we'll have a nice little lunch. Great. So the day comes, and we are in 2 cars because there's 10 of us. And if you've ever driven in Tuscany, it's not really easy to get anywhere. So we're driving and driving and driving for a number of hours, and I was getting a little nervous because it was getting close to the time I'm supposed to be there, and I wasn't really sure if we were there yet. So I stopped the car in the middle of the road, and I'm looking at my wife who's sort of navigating, and I said, I think this is the right place, but I don't know. Do you think this is the right place? And she looked out the window, and she said, well, considering there's a 12-foot tall poster of you on that wall over there, we're probably in the right place. And then we sort of looked around, and we were wondering, what are all the police doing here? And then I rolled the window down as we pulled up, and I'm trying to figure out, sir, is everything okay? And he's like, yes, it's David Baldacci Day in Barga. Park over here, sir. And, you know, we're dressed like in flip-flops and shorts and T-shirts, and when my wife hears that, she's like hitting me, you didn't tell me that it's David Baldacci Day. And I said, I didn't know it was David Baldacci Day in Barga. I thought we were going to have like a sandwich with the mayor. I don't know. So we pulled in, and, you know, the gates to the walled city open, and the mayor comes marching out. He's got the Italian and American flags draped over him. All these people are behind him. There's a freaking band playing music. And it really is David Baldacci Day in Barga. And I'm like, hey, you know, how you doing? So we took a tour through the city, and they flew the American flag over Barga for the first time since World War II, which I thought was kind of cool. My picture was on every spare wall in Barga. I'm sure people were sick of it. And we went and had a nice lunch with the mayor and like 800 of my closest, newest friends. And then took us to the Duomo at the top of the village where you go to the church. And then the mayor said, now it is time for your big speech in the center courtyard of the city where all of Barga attends. And I was like, that's great. So we go to the center, and the mayor is giving his big speech, and then they start giving me presents. They give me like 35 Italian flags, and a lifetime supply of olive oil, the St. Christopher's medal, which is their patron saint. They gave me, the coolest thing they gave me, other than the fact they made me an honorary citizen of Barga, which was only predicated on the fact that I vote for this mayor in each election. And if you know anything about Italian politics, that makes perfect sense. But they gave me a journal from the town archives and presented it to me. And it was a journal that my ancestor, Peter Baldacci, started writing in 1632. And paper was so precious and scarce back then that you would hand down journals that had unused paper in it. So the last entry in that journal was in 1885. And they gave this book to me, and the writing is of my ancestors in a beautiful Italian script. And I actually had the Library of Congress, a conservator here, restore the novel for me and put it into a nice box so it'll be maintained for additional subsequent generations of my family. And it was terrific. And they also gave me a genealogical chart that stopped at my grandfather's era. And I found on that genealogical chart 2 or 3 of my great aunts and uncles I'd never even known that I had, and also what had happened to them. So it was a wonderful day. Even though we were taken a little aback that it was David Baldacci Day in Barga, it was a nice day. Now, this next story illustrates the point that you're as well known as you think you are. You're never as well known as you think you are. I was at a restaurant with my wife having lunch one day, and we're having a nice meal and conversation, but every once in a while I would glance up, and every time I did, there was a woman across the restaurant who would be staring right at me. And I would look at her, and then she would look away. And there was a man next to her. I assumed it was her friend or husband. And this happened like 3 or 4 times. And finally, I looked at my wife, and I said, I think that lady's going to come over here. And sure enough, a few minutes later, here she comes. She marches over to the table. She sort of bends down, and she looks at me and smiles. And she said, you are who I think you are, aren't you? It's kind of a weird question, but I said, well, do you read fiction? She said, yes, I do. I said, well, then I probably am who you think I am. She said, I knew it. So she turns and screams across the restaurant to her husband, I was right, Joe. It's Grisham. So, my poor wife, blows iced tea out of her nose. But said very politely to the woman, "That's the right genre, but the wrong author." And the woman looked mortified, and she glanced back at me and said, "Are you Baldacci?" And she goes, "Yes, ma'am, I am." She screams across the restaurant again, "You're right, Joe. It's the Italian." John's here for the festival. He's a friend of mine. I love John. He's a great guy in many, many ways. At that point in my life, I didn't like John at all, but you just have to live with it sometimes. Now, I was at the LA Times Book Festival last April, and even though I've gotten a lot of questions over the years, I hadn't gotten this question before. And the guy stood up and he said, "What's the most bizarre thing that's ever happened to you out on book tour?" And even though I had never really thought about the question in those terms, the answer instantly came to me. And it's sort of appropriate because it happened at a national book festival a few years ago. Every night, the Friday night before the book festival, there's this gala at the Library of Congress. And the year I went, it was a black tie event, and you go, and an author sits at a table, and there are patrons of the Library of Congress who sit at that table, and they pay money to go, and that's a way to say thank you to these people for supporting the Library of Congress. They get to have a meal with favorite authors, and they get to talk to them. So I went in my black tie suit, and I got my table assignment, and I was at table 3 out of probably 200 tables in the Thomas Jefferson building. And I'm going through the sea of tables, and I find my table, and I'm going around the tables, like 10 people sitting there, and they each had their little name cards. And it was, an illustrious group. It was like chairman of AT&T, president of Target, commercial real estate developer, me, a woman I didn't know, only that she was from Maine, I think, President George W. Bush, and a couple of others. Okay, that's cool. And because the president was going to be sitting at the table, obviously the Secret Service comes over just to sort of check things out beforehand. But the lead agent on his protection detail was actually a Secret Service agent who I knew. She'd helped me with some research on a previous novel. Now, I didn't know the protocol, but she's a friend of mine, and I saw her walking over, so I went and gave her a hug. She gave me the most amazing pat down. To this day, I still remember it. It just was. And then the president came in, and I guess, the president was looking at me why are you hugging my Secret Service agent? Now, I had met President Bush when he was still the governor of Texas, and I had done an event in Texas for his mother, Barbara Bush, for the Barbara Bush Literacy Foundation. So we all sat down, and we're eating, and the woman to my right, who was from Maine, older woman, immaculately dressed, probably in her 80s, and she's talking to the president, and then finally she turns to me and she said, sort of very bluntly, she said, "Why are you here?" I said, "Oh, I'm one of the writers in the National Book Festival." She goes, "Oh, who are you? What's your name?" And I said, "David Baldacci." She goes, "I don't know you." I said, "That's okay, lots of people don't." And she said, "What do you write?" And I said, thrillers, mysteries. She said, "I read a mystery one time." She said, "Have you ever heard of Raymond Chandler?" I said, "Yes, he was legendary. He was huge back in the 40s and 50s, yes." She goes, "I liked his book." I said, "Yeah, me too." And that was it for like 5 minutes. And I'm talking to the woman on my left and eating my meal. And then all of a sudden, something grabs my arm, and I hear this woman saying, "I've got it, I've got it." And I look at her, and I thought she was having a seizure or something. I said, "Are you all right?" And she said, "No, I just thought of a way to off the president." I said, "Excuse me?" She said, "I just thought of a way to off the president." And I said, "Why?" She goes, "Well, you got me thinking because you write mysteries, and I was thinking of Raymond Chandler, and I just came up with this thing, the plot of how to do it." I said, "Okay, he's sitting right next to you." And she said, "Yeah, but I want to tell you my idea." And I said, "Well, I don't want to hear it." She goes, but I want to tell you, I think it'll work. And I said, ma'am, we can't talk about this. This is like a crime. You can't talk about this, okay? She goes, well, I want to tell you. And she said, I'm going to tell you, young man. And I didn't know what to do. I was just, nobody ever taught me how to handle stuff like this. And I said, well, could you whisper? She said, okay. He's guarded by Secret Service agents, right? I said, yes. There are 8 heavily armed ones around our table right now. She said, well, my bad guy would go to a Secret Service agent's home, off him, take his place, go to the White House, off the president. I said, that wouldn't work. She said, well, why wouldn't it work? And I said, well, they would know he's not a Secret Service agent. She said, well, the president can't possibly know all the Secret Service agents. There are too many of them. And I said, well, for his personal protection detail, he would. I mean, he spends 24/7 with these people. He would know them. But I said, forget that. The Secret Service it's an agency. They have supervisors. They have protocols. And if this guy showed up and tried to get in, not only would they not let him in, they would arrest him on the spot. It would never work. She said, well, I think it would work. And I said, fine. You write the book. She said, well, I want to see what he thinks. I swear I'm not making any of this up at all. Not even my imagination is that good. And I said, who thinks? She goes, President Bush. I said, you're going to turn around to the President of the United States and ask his opinion of a way you thought to off him? I said, ma'am, think about this. I'm a lawyer. I don't know you, you don't know me, but I would counsel you strongly not to do this. She said, well, I'm going to do it anyway. And I said, look, fine. You do it, and whatever happens, happens. And I took my chair, and I actually moved my chair this way, and I'm having a conversation with this woman. But I hear her telling the president this whole story. And then the whole table goes quiet, like the AT&T chairman drops his knife, his fork, his glass. It's just stone cold silent. And I did not want to look, but it's like a train wreck. You have to look, but I didn't want to look. And finally, I kind of did one of these. And here's President Bush is looking straight at me. And he said, ma'am, you ever read any of David Baldacci's books? And she said, no, I've read Raymond Chandler. He said, well, I'd give Baldacci a try because that boy's got a very vivid imagination. I put her up to it. I'm just trying to have my steak and my carrots, and I haven't been invited back to anything since then, so you could not win. I really appreciate you coming out. I hope you had a great time at the book festival. Please come back next year and have a great time.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.